So, hi, my name is DeSota. I'm chatting from DeSide Labs. I'll be talking a little bit about incremental publishing, which is a new model that we're playing around with right now. But really, we're talking about publishing. So let's start with that story. The first thing that I'm actually going to ping is a question to you. As I chat, I'm going to be talking about 3 core publishing patterns that we noticed and our reaction to this hypothesis, but I want you guys to think about the publishing patterns that you have in your heads so that you can tell us what we're missing, so that we can start iterating on this model. So first, let's talk about publication. What is publication now? Right now, it starts with a PDF. We've got a PDF, and we send it into this big box of the journal submission process. And sometimes it gets kicked out of the box and we have to try again. So we've got this. And then next, what's inside that journal publication process? The first one is curation. So we've got an editor who's like, hey, are you interesting to my journal? And if they say, I don't think you're interesting, then they'll kick you out. You gotta go back. You try this PDF, you submit it into another journal, but you have to pay another fee and you have to go through another process. And then we've got validation. So now the curator's like, this might be interesting, and we send it out to a bunch of peer reviewers, and then they have to keep all the variables of what is good science in their heads. They're like, are you good for the field? Are you novel? Do you have your data? Do you have your code? Are you doing good things? And some of these are just kind of lost, right? And then finally we have dissemination. You've made it through all of these checkboxes, and then you've got to fit all of the standards of the journal. This is what's currently the publication process, and it's this big box that is kind of closed off. Nothing comes in, nothing comes out, and you also can't access this PDF except for buying the access to it through the journal. So what would a publication system look like if we took apart this curation, this validation, this dissemination, and we separated it into multiple steps? The first thing labs identified was, all right, we're starting with a PDF. That doesn't seem right. Research is so much. Research isn't just a PDF. And so what we did is we tried to open the research stack. You go from submitting a PDF to how do we submit code and data and our PDF and our research doc and our tweet and our preprint, all of these different research objects. How do we associate that together? And this led to another bigger problem, which someone more technically experienced can talk about, but it led to this need to have this, specifically a new identifier. We went from DOI, which can only really register PDFs, and currently only about 50% of those PDFs actually resolve to the identifier that they're supposed to be in, to a new identifier system that allows us to have a whole folder structure. You can have 100 IDs, you can have 1,000 IDs that are associated with a DPID, or a decentralized PID, which then allows us all to take all of these research objects and connect them to one, so we can always reference every relevant part of the research. Next, we were thinking, okay, curation, validation, dissemination, we're all associated. How do we separate all of these questions that we're asking about our research? And how do we turn it into a conversation instead of into one big box? So what we're trying to do is how we can take the credit and the validation and distribute it, even if no one has curated or taken the publication, like a journal, for example, even if no one has taken that and said, I'm going to submit it to my journal, how do we still have valid research? And so our response to this was a combination of attestations and annotations. An annotation is just a comment on a paper. But for us, it's authored. You have an author so that that author can receive credit. It's well-defined, and it's, disclaimer, annotation, the definition for annotation is currently actually attestation. The definition for attestation is annotation. So flip these in your head. So if I'm going over an attestation, it's well-defined by an organization, it's atomic, and it's a verifiable claim that can go stamped on your paper. And then annotation is a comment that's associated with any research component. So let's go through the process of this. Instead of a peer review process that's hidden in a box, we start with the DeSci Foundation. This is an organization that has maybe high quality metrics, and they create an attestation, which is figure reproducibility. You take that attestation, now we have an author annotation. This author says, let's take this figure, make a DP, and this figure comes from data file. If we have an author annotation, this code comes from another data file. And then we have a reviewer who then does the same thing. We have a conversation over a research object, and then we give you the figure reproducibility on all of your research objects. So finally, we've got this bit of the journal submission process. What does this actually end up looking like? So what it looks like is now it's separated. Curation, author-controlled dissemination, and validation. So we have author-controlled dissemination. We start with a fair research object. This is your Twitter tweet, your pre-registered plan. And then as your research grows, you can see this updating. And we get multiple versions. And now you can also see that even on your pre-registered plan, you can start getting citations, accumulation of credit as you publish. Then we have the validation layer. This is the attestations and the annotations that I was talking about. An attestation goes on your pre-registered plan. It says, you have pre-registered your plan. An attestation might go, you have given your research notebook. And this also, similarly to your credits or your citations, aggregates over your research objects. And then finally, we have curation. Now completely separate from the validation of your research object, maybe PubPeer can grab your paper and people can discuss your paper. Next, maybe a preprint says, as long as you have attestation that you have available data and that you have a sound scientific process, I will publish you on my preprint. And finally, we have a journal who might say, all of these attestations that say you are valid research, now I will publish you. What this does is these attestations are portable across submissions, so if the preprint has validated your work, the journal doesn't have to do it again. We can distribute this labor. So this is our new system. It goes from one big box to separate systems. This is kind of the way we're seeing this might change it. And that's most of what I have to say today. Finally, we've actually built this in an application. So if you want to hear more about that, there will be a link here. There's a bunch of links in this, as well as a quick feedback form. What core publishing patterns do you think we're missing? What is the gap in what we've done? And I'd love to show people the application that we have, and John can also do that. But that's all. Yeah.
Can we move away from PDFs just in general when it comes to publishing research?
Woo!
Just like, by
Try.
my opinion, perhaps. But
Exactly.
Do you have any ideas as to kind of where we can start building these kinds of like verifying against change in content within the actual document itself? I mean, there's obviously you can do contradictory hashes for the various components within the document itself, but there really isn't any sort of set standard as to how to not only take that kind of, for lack of a better word, like syntax tree, like contradictory syntax tree, and presenting that as kind of a formalized versions like iteration that you can look at and say this is an actual document versus this is a subset of a larger document. The same way that we might have a PDF being like a complete package that goes forward. Are you seeing anything that's trying to tackle that kind of problem of replacing a PDF in this type of structure yet?
Just to make sure I understand what you're saying, you're asking, like, in the case that we have a smaller document that's maybe a preprint or maybe it's just a hypothesis.
Sure. How
do we measure that and the changes and updates to that as compared to a whole PDF or a whole manuscript?
Yeah, but in the same way, like being able to validate that what you're looking at is kind of the complete PDF, if you will, like the complete object of the document itself as its current state is.
Right. I mean, I think there are some ways to do that in terms of, at least on the Nodes platform, what we have right now is like the big paper is just labeled. Like, this is the final paper, this is the most updated version. And then as these versions update, you can define what the most updated piece of research is. In terms of, I don't know about in the protocol itself. I don't know if you have additional protocol thoughts on that. But I think mainly it's a UX question.
We should talk about it.
I think the workshop tomorrow is a great place to unpack
Yeah.
that question, because that's a really
Sure.
good question. But this Nodes is a replacement to the PDF.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's the big vision of it.
Yeah, Jelani.
So I think Nose is a fantastic platform. And the need to move away, or the desire to move away from PDFs, I think all of us as scientists have kind of more or less agree on that. We need some kind of container of knowledge that we can dump in more than just the manuscript, and the trust me bro, I did this and all that kind of stuff. But alongside the changing of the publishing infrastructure, or the changing of the publishing infrastructure extends oftentimes beyond just this unit of knowledge. There's reputation, there's everything that comes alongside that. And so as kind of a lead into that, what is the perspective of yourself, John, you can jump into this as well, and Noah's as a whole in terms of how do we tackle assigning a reputation aspect to this? The impact of this for a scientist's career. I can publish in Notes,
Right.
just like I can publish in bioarchive in a new unit, but if that doesn't translate into university credits, H impact factors, all these kind of things, why am I going to use this?
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a super valid question, and that gets back to this kind of annotation attestation question that we're trying to work on right now. Is that with an annotation, you go into the actual research object and you say like, here, let me annotate this and say that this research object over here is important, or alternatively, you can say this is an invalid statement, and you can start having this review. And each of those annotations, what I said back in the definitions of both an attestation and an annotation, is they're authored with an identifier, which means that we can credit all of these annotations, all of this work that we're already doing for science to those researchers. And you have that in a couple different ways. So there's attestations and annotations, which do that, which is the annotations over the document or the data or the figure or whatever else you're working. But there's also these, you can also in addition work on implementing, for example, the NISO credit table is something that we talk at labs a lot about. And the NISO credit table, you can just go through and annotate your document and say, hey, this person did the data analysis. This person uploaded the code. This person did this. And as a result, we can start having this ability or this facility to write down the credit of each of these researchers. Whereas right now we have there's no technical infrastructure that we have to be able to do that. And so the half that we're trying to do is to really start the accumulation of credit in a more granular way and give ourselves the tools to do that. And then in addition, this idea of accumulating citation and attestations over time, over each version. So it doesn't just start with once you're published. It starts even before you're published. And you can say, even if you don't get curated into Nature, because they're really, really looking for novel stuff, but you have really good, solid methods and research and data that anybody could use, then you also get credit for that because you're published, it has an identifier, and you can disseminate it yourself a little bit.
The next thing, or as an extension of that, of the annotation and attestation is, or at least based on what you said, it also provides you with the prospect of real-time peer reviewing.
Exactly.
Very much broader scale, right? So you talked about the journals, and they have to have a structure, a rubric, and how to analyze and how to validate a particular piece.
Right.
But that whole system in and of itself is broken.
Yeah.
And so with this kind of stuff seems to, based off of what you said, is again allow for that, a real-time, open peer review system that is accessible to, I guess, a variety of folks because this is a digital object.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can have that mentorship and helping to grow that piece of knowledge as it progresses continuously. And to his point, you then move away from the concept of a manuscript of one entity.
Right.
And the record itself becomes the ever-living, dynamic record of whatever that original question was.
Yes, which is a nice little word. There's someone came into our DeSci Foundation podcast and said like, you go from a version of the record to a record of all the different versions, which gives much more traceability. Super cool, super cool. And James.
So I think from a first principles perspective, like this makes a lot more sense than the current system we have. The question I have is how do you get scientists to start to use this kind of a system when they're not traditionally risk takers in new types of software?
Right. I think that's where we have this kind of tension between a UX that goes back into our comfort zone of the PDF viewer and then also the facility that you give them where you're working really based off of their reputation, which is a very familiar currency in science. And so I think right now the thing that we're focusing on a lot is the things that they're already doing, which is reading research papers, annotating it in terms of as a consumer, as a publisher, you're already trying to figure out what to do with your data. You're already trying to figure out with your code, and you're already trying to find ways to get more citations and more impact. And so how can we really do that in terms of having a preprint platform where you can start aggregating citations a little bit, but a lot of people won't use them because it's not peer reviewed, it's not reviewed, you don't have this validation that started happening, and so it's hard to get people to start using your paper, which is good. We want validated science to be used, but maybe we should validate before you've crossed the barrier of a media company, which essentially a journal is. So the idea is to try and work that reputation in and that currency of reputation long before we get into the point of novelty, which is a good curation, but not a curation that should create a barrier to all of the other science that's going on.
So how do you think about and balance the customer being the scientist itself, or herself, and the journal entity, the media company, which would also be the user customer of this platform, right? How do you guys sort of think about that? Because I think the point's very well taken, right? The scientists are motivated by reputational improvement. That happens by being published in the journal of credibility. The journal of credibility is certainly looking for scientists that are creating innovative, new research. It's a back and forth marketplace. And I heard a lot about half of the equation, right? How this improves the scientists' effort, how the data is, compartmentalized, how it's shared. But have you thought about the other half of the equation and how that would interact back and forth from utilizing the platform and making the media side life easier as well as the scientists?
Yeah. So in terms of specifically thinking about journals, right? Yeah, absolutely. So I think the thing that we're thinking right now is journals have this blocker of they need to find all of the reviewers and they need to define their whole statement of who they are, and they have their own reputation game to play, and they also have a massive curation game. They have to figure out who is relevant to bring in. And so what we're trying to do is to make this process for a journal a lot easier as well. This journal can now, instead of being you're publishing our research, we're a black box, you can also have a system of, one thing that we're working on right now is a system of identifiers for the validated peer reviewers who are there. And these identifiers are associated with all the annotations they made, the attestations they've made, and it becomes much easier to automate the process of finding a really good reviewer. And not only finding a good reviewer, but finding a good reviewer who isn't biased by the fact that they were a co-author with this other author on this paper. And so it's now you have both this social layer of the social network of who's a relevant reviewer, and then in addition, you have all of their research objects. Now, instead of PLOS needing to fight you to get your data and get your code, which is a wonderful thing that they do, is make sure that this is available, it's already been set, it's already reproducible, and the journal also gets this bump of being hey, all of the papers in our journal are 100% reproducible, and you can check it, and anybody else can check it, and it gives them their own reputation and their own criteria for this.
So just sort of have a comment in general around this.
Last question.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No,
You are the last
are.
question. You're
Okay, because I said I had more of a comment than a question, that's why.
No, last comment.
So, the way I sort of see it from the description of how this works is I don't really think that, we've basically gone in the publishing industry from journals being non-commercialized or not really commercialized to incrementally becoming way more commercialized from a publishing perspective than they used to be, way more paywall than they used to be. And so I feel like there's this social dynamic that you have within these journals in terms of the researchers that they send stuff out to get peer reviewed, or at least review the document itself, and then comment on whether it should be included or not. So there's that social kind of curation dynamic. Then you have what is sort of attested by the collective authority of that social dynamic as a sort of named group into this particular category of research. But if you're breaking down these barriers about what is considered within a curated collection as being something that curated collection is being paywalled, so if you're eliminating that paywall, and the necessity of that curated collection kind of goes away, the necessity for like a named grouping kind of goes away a little bit, and you get much more kind of ad hoc groupings of people leaving and entering different spaces. And so it becomes more of a social graph of the researchers that are attesting to specific claims that are being made from an attestation perspective. And if you make an attestation, someone else makes an attestation, you know, you're not necessarily potentially valued based on what work you're producing and who's attesting to that. The quality of your attestation is affecting the quality of their attestation towards you and vice versa. So it becomes much more of a collaborative effort with regards to recognition, credit within the overall system as far as, you know, advancement in academic space.
So this is a very deep conversation.
Workshop.
Come
Yeah.
to the workshop tomorrow.
Workshop.
Agree,
We're
agree,
starting
agree.
a Web of Trust. So let's talk about Web of Trust.